my friend, my mentor, Pam Davis-Kean. Pam is a professor of psychology and also a research professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. She directs the Population Neuroscience and Genetics Research Core. Her own research is on achievement in children, and she's really leading the charge in psychological science to really increase the power, the rigor of psychological research so that what we're concluding actually holds up and we can make sound recommendations based on our conclusions. She's here to talk about that work today, and she's open to questions as she goes along, so feel free to interrupt her, and please join me in welcoming Pam.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm used to speaking in front of an interdisciplinary group of faculty. For those of you who know economists, they will stop you on slide 1. And so I am happy for you to ask questions. There might be things I'm talking about that you may not have thought about or heard about. And so you should ask me questions as I go along about some of the acronyms I'm going to be using or some of the statements I'm going to be making. And so really what I want to show you is there's a way to bring power to your research. For the graduate students, this is a graduate student seminar, that there's a lot of data already available. It's actually better data in some ways than you collecting it. As I know, I have a psychology background. I went to ISR and they contaminated me a little bit on these large-scale data sets. But what I found is that I can answer all of my questions because I have enough power to do so. And I'm going to talk about these issues that coincide with another thing I'm involved with, which is improving psychological science, making it better, more replicable, and thinking about the issues that psychology is now getting hit very strongly with, about why a lot of our studies are now being retracted or not replicated. So I'll get on that a little bit too, because I was involved in that. So this is a little bit of the outline. I'm going to talk about these issues that are confronting psychology. I'm going to discuss about developmental science particularly, since I'm a developmentalist, what we can do to address those problems. I'm going to talk about some of the things we've already done. There are people in this room that were part of a center where we were trying to address these, and now still a center, but here at Austin. I moved from Michigan to Austin. And secondary data analysis and how it can be used. And I'm going to talk, a lot of people worry about data being the data focus. I'm going to show you that most of my work is looking at theory and trying to actually find out how the data can inform the theory and changes in theory. So a lot of people think it's, is this data mining? No, it's not data mining. It's doing exactly what we're always supposed to do, which is have a hypothesis and then test the hypothesis, but having enough data to actually do it correctly. So I want to talk a little bit about what came out. This was last September in the APS Observer by Hal Pashlier. These kinds of arguments, the issue of responsibility in our field and our reputation in psychology, arguments carry no weight for a number of reasons. One is the deadly combination of publication bias and low power that indisputably characterize much of the behavioral research. Operating in tandem, these twin defects are in and of themselves fully sufficient to guarantee that our literature will be replete with imaginary findings, as statistician John Ioannidis showed in his famous 2005 article. Second, the situation is really far worse than what Ioannidis reckoned, since we know now that our field has many corrupted data analysis practices like p-hacking, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what p-hacking is, and that greatly exacerbate the impact of publication bias and low power. So what does this mean? It means that much of what we're looking at in our studies, the meta-analyses that we've done, have been on publications that have been manipulated in some way to find significance that was not there. And so we are training students, and you are being trained off phenomena that we actually don't know if it exists or not, because for years we've been actually doing things to our science that have made the science less rigorous, less replicable, and problematic. And that's what we keep finding over and over again, which is why you hear about things like multiple retractions going on. So I'm very involved with APS, the Association for Psych Science. The major journal there, Psych Science, has a high impact factor. They're retracting practically every month these days because people are finding things that have been manipulated and also not replicated. But we're actually talking about some conscientious things that are done. Some of them are problems, some of them are not. So I'm going to talk about the ones that we have problems with, lack of replications, lab studies that have been done, single studies that have defined certain areas of research, that now are not replicating. So this is social psych and cognitive psychology have had real problems having replications. Harking, have anybody heard about harking previous to this talk? So I'll tell you a little bit about, yeah, we know about harking. This is reporting a p-value which was not the p-value you actually found in your statistics, right? So it's a 0.054, 0.056, close enough. Let's call that 0.05, and let's publish that way. Lots of harking going on. We actually have a program that now goes through. It's called StatCheck. Some of you may not have heard about that, but the psych science groups are using it pretty frequently, running publications through StatCheck to find out how many times people reported a p-value which is not actually the p-value that they found. Do you know how we can do that from published papers, how we find out about harking? So even though people adjusted the p-value to make it less than 0.05, they didn't actually adjust the f-test that's used. And all you have to do is look at the degrees of freedom and the f-test to see what the actual significance is. And that's all that StatCheck is doing. It's going through and saying, is this actually the p-value you would have gotten with these degrees of freedom and the f-test? And these numbers here, JPSP, the #1 journal of social psychology, in 1 year had 40% of their publications harked, right? Adjusted p-values. So developmental psych, one of our top ones, 32% had been harked, right? They just ran it through, did the coding to find out that people had given t-test or f-test, gave degrees of freedom, and adjusted the p-value, right, to say something was significant. So p-hacking, which is another thing pretty popular you might have heard about, so that's harking. P-hacking is doing things like snooping the data, doing multiple comparisons and not correcting for them, or not telling people you did multiple comparisons. So you ran and ran and ran and ran the data, and then, oh, here's a significant finding. I'm going to report my entire paper as if that was what I wanted to say. But I ran 20, 25, who knows, 30 t-test, found the one significant, and it ends up being, if you run that many, we're all in a probabilistic system, you're going to find one thing significant, and it's going to be just by chance. It's not actually going to be a true finding. So lots of p-hacking. People are using what's called p-curves to find out if something has been p-hacked by seeing whether or not the distribution is an abnormal distribution, suggesting that most of the p-values have been something that came through multiple iterations, right? So that's Yuri Simonson has put out lots of publications on p-curving as a way to catch when people have abnormal amount of significant findings for a phenomena. So this is now how this is being done. Also snooping the data. So this is, again, the same idea that you're looking for the finding, and then you report in the paper the finding as if it was your hypothesis, even though it was not. So what's a common thing I tell my students that I hear all the time? Oh, I got the data, and so I've been looking at the data. I've been running some stuff. And, oh, so the first thing that I thought was going to happen wasn't there. But, oh, look at this. There's a gender difference. Right? So it seems really common. It's a pretty common practice. And it ends up being it's wrong. Right? We shouldn't be doing that. It was always wrong, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Low-powered studies. So I'm going to talk a lot about this today. So the issue with our N, so we have students at Michigan for 5 years. It's very hard to get the kind of power we need in studies collected on primary data collection in 5 years. So we're almost always going to have a power problem. There are ways to think differently so that you won't have that power problem. But most of the time you end up with 30. In fact, I was talking to Julie about this. I said, for some reason, 30 in cognitive was like, I never understood. I'm like, why 30? Why is it always 30 a cell? Where did that come from? That's enough power. It's never enough power. I mean, people have been looking at, Yuri Simonson and Joe Simmons have this really nice paper about how underpowered our studies have been forever in experiments. That would be if you had one variable, right? And most of the time people have multiple variables. So we've had low power studies. That means that people are adjusting their p-values because they never had enough power to find what they wanted to begin with, and it creates this p-hacking and this harking that's been going on. Claiming no causal connection, then claiming policy and intervention relations. So this is my bugaboo about when you write papers. The editors do demand this. It's ridiculous, so that at the end, you haven't really found much, but you have to say you found something. So you jump from your 30-person study You say, oh, I did correlational study, so I can't talk about causality, but damned if my last paragraph isn't going to be how this is going to change the world, right? So if this is important in the field of education, then everybody should be doing this. And I know this because of the 30 people that I just studied, right? But now we've wildly generalized out to the population, and we didn't have a population study to do so. But psychology's been doing this for a long time. And I say this rare problems maybe, and I've added that maybe recently, because unfortunately we're finding more and more people who are actively manipulating their data. At first we thought it was only a few. Many of them were well known. We had one at University of Michigan, Larry Sana, who had to resign his tenure because he was caught manipulating and fabricating data. He did it at UNC. He was only at Michigan. That's our claim. He was only here for 6 months, so it wasn't our fault. But it was one of the first cases, along with quite a few in the Netherlands, that came out where they were actively manipulating data. They would go into, and there was another one at Harvard, pretty famous. Kind of the scenario is graduate students were working on data. They weren't finding anything significant. The faculty member would walk into their office, close the door, come back out and say, oh, look, it's all working. You just didn't do it right. And data changed. And it wasn't the data they originally had, and data changed. So and again, I thought it was rare, except we keep coming up. More and more, you'll start seeing people where it looks like there was not unintentional, right? I copy and pasted the wrong thing from my SPSS or R into my table, unintentional, but actual intentional manipulation of data. So I don't know how bad this is because it keeps coming out. So at first I thought it was rare. And now I'm not so sure how rare it is. It's just it's taken us a while to find it because you have to get a hold of that data in order to find that it's been manipulated from the original data. And that takes a while, and not surprisingly, people now are kind of scared to give data of which they might have done some manipulations on, right? So I have a confession to make, which is that when I was a grad student at Vanderbilt in the quantitative methods program, I knew all of these issues, right? I knew that people were, because I was teaching and I was training people statistics, and then that was followed in the hallway with like, yeah, but nobody publishes that way, right? So you're telling me that I have to have a hypothesis and I have to stick all the way through, but so-and-so's publishing papers all the time and all they're doing is running analyses, right? Especially this multiple comparisons and not making any corrections. So do I really have to do that? Because I need to get this paper out. So I've known these problems for years, and every now and then the methodologist would peek up and say, we're not doing this right, we're not doing this right, and then they'd be like, oh, shut up, go sit down. And then what ended up happening was this huge, I think, group of people starting to become much more trained in the issues of analyses. We were able to do a lot of programming that was able to catch things in larger amounts than we were able to do before. Yuri Simonson found these big cases that occurred of fraud. And then it just started escalating. So now there's kind of no stopping this movement anymore. People are like, we've got to get back to the way, these aren't new. Like I was saying that Amy Cuddy in a New York Times article, and she's been getting hit for the power posing thing, the issue, said, oh, the rules changed. And I'm like, the rules never changed. These were always the rules. What changed is that people said, stop breaking the rules, and let's go back to doing the rules as statistics was defined to do, right? So that, when I've looked at things, I've always been worried, which is why I set up a center at University of Michigan to try to correct some of these things, at least what in the area I had some control over, which was developmental. So I couldn't fix social, couldn't fix cognitive. They were going to have to deal with their own issues, and they have. They're the ones who've gotten hit the most, because a lot of this has come from experimentation, small N studies through experimentation. And I do want to just mention as an artifact of small N studies, you will get, if you do small N studies, you will get inflated effect sizes. So these often look like high effect sizes that weren't true. It was actually an artifact of using small N. So people were reporting, which you don't see in psychology ever, like 0.80 effect sizes, which is almost a guaranteed, if you do this, this is what will happen. Except that wasn't how the behavior was working, but they were reporting these huge effect sizes. And it's really an artifact of low sample size that you get these big ones. So APS, I was the program chair of developmental. There was a time when these were starting to come out. People were starting, the fraud issues were starting to occur. And so I said, you know, we need to deal with this in psychology. We really have to get in front of it because otherwise we're going to get killed for all of these issues because we have so many of them. And so we had a conference on it where people like Brian Nozick came in and other groups of people came in and said, yep, this is what we're finding. Replication problems, p-hacking problems, harking problems, multiple comparisons. This was around the time that neuroscience got hit for the fact that they weren't correcting for multiple comparisons. So the brains were lighting up everywhere. We give you a stimulus. You know, the brain is reacting in this way. And it ended up being they weren't correcting for the fact that they did hundreds of t-tests in order to find that as soon as they started correcting for multiple comparisons, the areas of the brain that were lighting up was much smaller. So neuroscience had to go back and correct all of their stuff as well. Multiple blogs. Now blogs are really the place where most of the action are regarding these issues have come up. And then SIPS was created, which is the Society for Improving Psychological Science. So an attempt to get people together to create ways that people can do their science more rigorously and correctly, to change the incentive structure that allowed for p-hacking and harking, and to really bring methodologists together to try to think of better ways to do psychological science than that has been done in order to know what it is that we should be. I mean, if you think about the years that we might have been studying something that didn't have an effect, it's pretty disappointing, right? How much is in our journals, how many students have been trained, how many faculty have been trained, and it might have all been based on the bad science that we were doing. All right, so 10 years ago, I started a group, more than 10. It's got to be like 12 or 13 now. Researchers together to discuss how to replicate findings across the community in developmental science. So my idea was, this actually came out of the fact I got tired in developmental that single studies that were done on very particular populations were what we understood about anything. About spanking, about aggression, about achievement, about, you know, and that was it. One study, people were citing it all the time. This is what we know. It became fact, you know, off of one study. So what I wanted to do was to look and see whether or not, if we knew that effect, could we replicate it multiple times? Could we use it in a more powerful way, so existing data sets? Could we generalize by looking at population studies, so bringing in population studies? And so there was a lot of debate about the findings. We put together psychologists, sociologists, economists, educational researchers to look at these questions, because I also wanted people to be challenged. Did we do it correctly? Is there a better way to do it? Should we think about it? So within this group, we had lots of arguments and discussions about, is that the right way to do that analysis? Should we be doing it in another way? And so we used a lot of the population studies because the data was available. It was available for us to do that. And so we're still doing it today, but we were doing it for a long time, put out some really good papers. So we had a relatively large set of established, familiar, and committed longitudinal projects. So these weren't just the national studies that are available. We asked people like Ken Dodge to make his data available. We asked people like Jackie Eccles to make her data sets available. Andy Collins with the Minnesota longitudinal study to make their data sets available. I had commitments and agreements at all different kinds in order for people to actually be involved in these projects, right? So they would allow the data to be, we could analyze it, but nobody else could, right? So we had to have kind of personal agreements of people who were willing to make their longitudinal data available. And then we had the longitudinal population studies available, or the NICHD National Child Care Project, which had also been provided for people to look at. So there were other kinds of data sets that we had. Not these data sets, some of the ones we used are not ones that you can get access to unless you talk to the PIs, but they agreed to be part of this because they also thought this was important, to find out whether or not the findings held in other national data sets or other data sets. And kind of the idea was, too, if you've been collecting aggression data, you also collected achievement data because those things co-varied. And so you had it in there, but you weren't really analyzing the achievement data. But what if you had someone who was an achievement expert who could look at your data set and come up with a different question? And what if you'd been looking at achievement data and you got behavior problems because you know it co-varied, but you weren't really looking at behavior problems, but yet you had experts in behavior problems in the group? Could you come up with new questions? And so this is what we did. People got together, they came up with new questions. Some of them had exact things they wanted to try to replicate. So Liz Gershoff, who's here, really wanted to deal with the issue of spanking. There was a single paper that was really defining issues regarding race differences in spanking, and so she really wanted wanted to see if she could replicate that finding. So there was a whole group set up just to see if that replicated in other data sets. So that was one group, and she's now done 3 or 4 papers out of that. And we also hired full-time, 100% data analysts to do the longitudinal studies. So the faculty themselves didn't have to know how to do it. We had analysts who knew how to do it, who worked with complicated longitudinal data. They knew missing data techniques, and so all you had to do was come with a question. And we would handle it from there and work together with these questions to figure out the best way to analyze them using longitudinal techniques. Yep.
I have a question about doing corrections for multiple comparisons, because now we have a big data set and you have lots of different people coming with different questions. Do you correct for all the possible, like present, past, and future?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Like how many, yeah. So multiple comparisons are really about your hypotheses and what you go to find, right? So even though other people are using the same data set and they may have done some type of comparison, there I think you just have to say, well, what were the effects that they found in that? But any multiple comparison correction is about your hypotheses and the amount that you're running that data. It would be too hard to do kind of a massive correction for everybody, and you have to assume those are different hypotheses, that there's not like 20 people all running the same hypothesis. If there is, then actually kind of in the bigger world, you do have to correct for that. But people should be coming to data sets with different questions and hypotheses, not all with the same one.
So I guess I don't really fully understand why having a different hypothesis matters for this issue of correction. Because if you go to a single data set and you ask it 20 different questions, doesn't it mean that one of those is likely to be a type 1 error?
20 different questions that are using different variables set up in different ways should be 20 different hypotheses, right? So I guess let me back up and say that you should never go to the data unless you have a question, and you should only answer with that question, right? So everyone coming in should have a different question, right? So there is no, I mean, one of the things that people have talked about, this is also something I learned as a graduate student, I never see people do, because one of the complaints I get is, oh, but what about exploratory analyses? Like, how do we do that? It's always been okay to take 10% of a data set and run exploratory and confirm it on the 90% of the data set. That's always been an adequate way to think about exploring your data, not taking the full 100% and running whatever you want till you find a significance level. Because it doesn't mean if you took 10%, you're actually going to find what you thought in the 90%. You have all kinds of different variants coming in. But at least you can get a model that you can then take to a larger part of the data set. But it really, I mean, I've worked on these data sets for a long time. I've seen the publications come out of it, and it's rarely we have the same question that I would need to worry about a multiple comparison. That the question is so, because mostly you won't even get your paper accepted because someone's like, I just saw something just like that. So how is this new? How is this novel? Right? So I think, you know, people worry about the fact that there's a limited amount of questions, but it ends up being that we're pretty good at coming up with really different questions. That we even take to data sets that have the same data. Right? And sometimes you're not even looking at the same people, even when you're using that data set, because you only want to look at one group instead of the whole thing, right? Okay. So we have implications for effective interventions, dissemination of substantive and methodological. These were kind of the things we want to do, replicate research instead of relying on single studies. Data sharing and collaborative work. So we also shared our data back and forth. And we hope that to inform our science on what are strong and weak findings. So the big issue here is effect sizes. So we have a lot in psychology in general. On average, I think Janet Hyde said this when she was looking at gender research, it's about 0.20. And it really, I would say it's more like 0.18. We have very subtle effects in psychology, right? All the big effects are known. And most of what we work with now are kind of 0.18. And I do parents' education attainment and income, and together those are like 0.30, right? Those are some of the most powerful predictors we have, and the effect size combined is not even that high, right? It varies depending on whether or not education and income is particularly important, like in poverty samples, but in non-poverty samples, it's a pretty small effect in the world of the fact that a big effect is 0.80, right? We rarely have those kind of effects. These were the goals of the research group, and these are all the questions. So you're asking about, these are all the questions that were coming in from the people that were involved, right? So there's not a lot of overlap between some of these questions. We had lots of people that had their own expertise, their own thoughts, their own desires about what they wanted to look at, And these are just a subset of the questions, all of which have been published in some way from this group coming together. And so I wanted to show you. So Greg Duncan did one of the first papers that came out. It was actually quite controversial, which was interesting. He took 6 longitudinal data sets. They estimated the links between 3 key elements of school readiness: school entry, academic attention, socio-emotional skills. And then at the end, after they pulled all these 6 data sets together, they looked for ones that had all of these variables. They did a meta-analysis within the study in order to get the actual effect sizes, to find the effect sizes of these. At the time, the issue was Head Start was considering taking away teaching basic skills and just doing socio-emotional intervention. And Greg was really concerned that by doing so, it was going to leave the Head Start kids with one of the prominent things that they knew, which was getting early basic skills. And so he was concerned that they were, because people had made quite a big deal that, oh, no, it's not achievement, basic skills and academics, it's socio-emotional skills. And so he really wanted to find out what the different effects were between these across all of these studies and replicated across these studies. So this, I don't know if you can see it well, is kind of what they found. So reading and math, and this is not surprising, this is the Woodcock-Johnson, so basically it's auto-regression. The achievement tests are set up and designed in order to be predictive across time, and so that's basically what they find. The largest effects, and look at this, this is the 0.2 line, right? The largest effects are in reading and math across time. Attention skills are the 3rd kind of highest effect size that you find in these data sets. But if you look at internalizing behavior, so depression, sadness, externalizing behavior, behavior problems that people are concerned about, and then social skills, none of these were having much of an effect, some of them close to 0. And again, this is cumulative across these replications that they were looking at. I mean, look at social skills. It's really hovering around 0. So the prediction to later reading and math is really coming from your early math skills. This is not shocking to anybody in education. And actually, kind of an important thing that got lost in all of this was attention. Very few people really went to the fact that attention was the 3rd kind of strongest, that wasn't an auto-regression to this. And it got lost in them all complaining about this. Because there were a lot of people really invested in these skills being predictive of achievement, and they ended up not being achievement across Canada, the UK, multiple data sets in the US that were looking at this. So this did not replicate across countries. It did not replicate within the US as far as the social skills and these behavior problems being the primary motivator of achievement. It was really coming from things that we think would be related to achievement: prior ability, and then attention skills. I was very sad that attention got lost in this, because I think it's huge that early on attention skills matter, right? So that's falling into the executive function area. But this got published in Developmental Psych. There was so many issues regarding it in Developmental Psych that they did something I've never seen them do. People were complaining it was done wrong, and so they said, okay, if you don't think this replication of 6 studies was done correctly. By the way, this was kind of the first time. These articles were the first time these kind of replications were coming into the developmental literature. They said, we'll give you, because, and we agreed as this center, the Kapka Center, we agreed to make all the data available that was used in that analyses, and if they reran it and found something different, Developmental Psych said, we'll publish it. We'll publish it. And so a few people took up the banner. They got 4 additional studies on them. All they did was replicate what was found, and then they added early motor skills as a predictor. Nobody found this not to be true. And I don't know why they thought they would, because most of this is just data that's available to them too, right? We weren't really adding like new data. So that was a very unusual thing. But again, these were the first time these kind of papers were entering the developmental literature, where people were actually looking at more than one study and trying to replicate across. So this is a study I did. I look at self-concept of ability. There's been real issues about when you can even collect data on young kids, on their own beliefs about their ability level. So I looked at, Jackie Eccles has this data set called Childhood and Beyond. It has 3 independent cohorts that use exactly the same measures. She measures them across time. They had 300, 400 people in them. Because it used exactly the same measurement, I could replicate across these independent cohorts. and I could actually see whether or not I had come from graduate school with a paper that suggests that there was a developmental change in self-concept of ability. Kids really can't do it early on. They can't really tell you how they feel, but it comes online, and then it gets very predictive into high school. And I really wanted to test this longitudinal theory that I had that I kind of developed through graduate school in my early years. I'm sorry this is this way, but let me just point out a few things. This is in child development, so if you want to read it, you can go get it. That early on in the data, I don't think this is, maybe I'm not doing it right. Anyway, early on, the far left, the relation in grade 1 is almost nothing, 0.12, between kids' ability to talk about their self-concept and relating to grades. So we were trying to get something that was actually independent of the kids, something that was done by other people. And then you'll see that across time, it goes up. And it gets quite strong kind of in the later years. I was able to both replicate over ages, so you'll see that it kind of holds. What's really shocking, and that every time we do these replications I'm really surprised about, is how the effect sizes seem to be the same also. So I mean, it really is amazing how, and again, these are all independent cohorts. So you see the same 0.3, and then up here you start seeing some higher ones in the highest age groups. Right? So this gives a sense of why, if you go in and you look at self-concept of ability at some age and a different age, why you might see very different findings. Right? There's a developmental change going on. And it was very important for me to have a developmental story of why we need to be careful when we think we're going to give measures to kids, because when we're asking things like, do you think you're good at math? And those of you who might have collected this kind of data, kindergarten and first grade kids are like, oh yeah, I am the best. They really have this positive bias, which I wish would stay with them longer than it does. But around 8 years of age, they start saying, no, I am not good. I'm not good at soccer. I'm not good at math. And they start pulling out of things. That's when you start seeing this decline in kids wanting to continue on, because now they're reflecting differently. So I've talked to Henry Wellman about it, who looks at theory of mind. And he said, yes, he thinks in theory of mind you can think about how others think, but you don't really think about how you think until much older. And that's when we start seeing these changes going on. So not only did we do that, in the same paper, we were interested in self-concept of your ability to stop yourself from hitting others or aggressing against others. So this is Ken Dodge's work. In his work, it would suggest that no matter what age, if you go through this very quick kind of social decision-making scale, oh, that person did something, they did it because they hate me and I'm going to aggress against them, it would happen true across all ages. They've been collecting what they call the self-efficacy of aggression, whether or not you're going to hit somebody or whether or not you can stop yourself. So we did the same thing with theirs, and I have to say, shocking to Ken Dodge. And he's actually changed his theory because of this. Shocking to Ken, they were part of this paper. I will say it's great to also have people part of the paper so that you're not kind of telling them something. Their efficacy scale did not matter at all until these kids were 8 years of age. Right? So all the stuff that they've been publishing on and think they were finding between self-efficacy of aggression and aggression doesn't occur until much older. Right? And so he's now gone back and said, developmentally speaking, we shouldn't expect to see these differences until now. But his theory prior to this was that we should always see them, which is why they were collecting that information. So what's interesting is how few people have actually longitudinally looked at their data and the relations that their theory suggests should be there. And this is part of what we were going back and doing, is proving the theory. Was this actually true, and was it true across development? So this is all in the same child development paper, where we looked at 2 different kinds of efficacy and we looked longitudinally across time. And this was because we had access to this data, this incredibly rich longitudinal data. So how does this change theory? And I just talked about that. One of the big things, and we're still kind of doing this, is what is normative change? So I will tell you, in the world of development, we don't actually know what we call the functional form of development. What's the normative functional form? Should we see things going up and then down, right? So you might expect, and we know this with aggression, for example, that age 2 and then adolescence are the 2 peaks in aggression around puberty. But most of the time it's down. It should go down when they go to school. That would be the normative thing to go down. But people haven't really plotted their theory to what we know to be these kind of normative changes. For achievement, does anyone know what happens with, what's the functional form of achievement? Yeah, so the highest change is in kindergarten, and then they plateau at grade 5, right? So it's interesting to think about why is it that around grade 5 you start seeing a lack of change, which for those who've had to deal with a public policy of, oh, you have to show change, the teachers have to show change, I keep saying, but what if the kids are no longer having I mean, the biggest change is in kindergarten. And we know that because they're all getting information for the first time. And then there seems to be a building, skill building, and then something about maybe incorporation going on at 5th grade that doesn't show big leaps anymore in skills, which is what the achievement tests are getting at, right? So we don't know this for most of the things we look at. We don't know the functional forms. We don't know if we're going in and studying 13-year-olds, why they may look different than 5. But often in our literature reviews, we're talking about 5-year-olds and saying, oh, but I didn't find what you found when they were 5. That's right. They had normative developmental change, and that's what you're capturing at 13. It's not abnormal. It's not different, and often we'll talk about those as big differences. It's normative. So just even figuring this out with the longitudinal data is a big contribution to developmental so that we know, well, where should we see these things? And if a kid isn't coming down in aggression when we think they should, then that's a problem, because that's not normative. And so we need to figure out why there's certain kids who aren't coming down in these things, or going up when they should be going up. Why would a kindergarten child not be jumping as high as they should? What we'd expect, right? So we need to go look at that. All right, secondary data for psychologists. So in general, and this was the case when I was in graduate school, I had to argue for the fact, I did a meta-analysis for my dissertation. I actually had a member say, I don't know if we can allow you to do this because our whole thing is about primary data collection. Then I had to argue that meta-analysis was primary data collection. But it was such a thing, and it was true when I first got to Michigan, that we demand that our students in psychology do primary data collection. There's reasons to value that, right? Getting to know kids, getting to know families, getting to know people is a good thing for us to adapt and think about our theory. So there's nothing wrong with primary data collection. I know a lot about the issues of measurement because I've done primary data collection, and I know some of our measurement sucks and we never really adjust it correctly. But there are limitations when you force everyone to do primary data collection for their dissertation. In fact, I've said this openly at Michigan, that we are basically setting up our students to do underpowered studies. And they're going out into the world with potentially ones they've adjusted incorrectly. They've harked, they've p-hacked in order to find them. We have something called the 3-paper dissertation, which is really setting you up for those 3 published papers that you're going to have when you go out to get a job. How are you getting those in 5 years? How are you getting those if you're doing primary data collection on all of them? What is your sample size? So that's a real issue. This is the question that when I started at CAPCA, the very first meeting that we had, this was the question I asked everybody in the room. If you had access to limitless amounts of data, what question would you ask? So most of us have our research. I have and you should, the research that you do, our program of research that we do. But we're limited by how much we could collect or put together at any given time in our surveys, our interviews, our assessments that we did. But if you weren't limited by that, what additional questions would you ask for your program of studies that you would want to do? And that's where people started expanding. My thing was, if I had longitudinal data, I could finally look at self-concept of ability and figure out whether or not this true developmental change that I think is going on, that I've hypothesized is going on, is actually going on. So I was able to answer that question that was important to me to answer. So population studies like the ECLS-K, how many of you have used the K or the B? There's a new K. Rob, I know you have. We talk about the K all the time. I hate the B because it's so hard to get. But nonetheless, fragile families, this is a huge birth cohort study I'll tell you about because people I work with use it. It is representative of the United States, but it's done in urban areas to get at families that are highly likely to break up over the time of the course of a child's life. It started, they recruited in the hospitals. The kids are age 15 now. It now has 3 waves of genetic data, and it has 1 wave of imaging data. So they're imaging the 15-year-olds. They have all the information prior to that about their socioeconomic status, their family changes. This is a data set that just released its year 15 data. What you can say with that data, and it's huge what hasn't been said with that data, is available. The Child Development Supplement with PSID, I actually designed the 1997 version of that. It has 3 waves. The kids that started off in that are now adults and now are in the PSID itself, so we can follow kids all the way as their own economic situation is occurring. And they've just started a new CDS second cohort, and they're in the second. They're asking for money for the second wave of that. So these are a group of nationally represented families who are having children that we're following over time. The NLSY similarly it started off as parents of kids of adolescent mothers, followed across time. Now it's gotten more representative. These are all available. Download them. Go get the, I don't think they do. The ECLS I still don't have on CD-ROM. The NICHD Child Care Study is another one developed. It's the only study developed by developmental psychologists that have all the kind of the developmental measures in them. Some of these other ones have been designed by other groups, except for the CDS, because I'm a developmental psychologist, that also has the kind of stuff that you'd expect in developmental psych. Yep.
When I talk about these, I always like to tell grad students, too, that many of these groups run workshops where they will teach you how to use the data set.
All summer long.
That can be intimidating because these are complicated data sets. So many of them have workshops every year where you can go and learn how to use the data. So
right.
Makes it easier to
The K, 20,000 kids across the United States in every form of schooling, starting at kindergarten through 8th grade. Is that right? 8th grade, yeah. 20,000. What can you not find out about achievement with 20,000 kids? They're not necessarily designed for psychological questions, as I was just saying. The NICHD is. The PSID to some point is from 1997 because I designed it, so it has a lot of psychological measures in it. They're representative and so begin to address the chronic problem of the weird population. So this was a paper that came out a little while ago by Henrik, who was basically saying all the science we've done has been on a very small slice of people. In the case of psychology, it's almost all on college students, which are a very weird population in and of themselves. And I don't mean that because they're weird, but because they're highly educated and they got to college. So that makes them very different than most of the people in the United States. So it helps deal with those issues that we have. Very problematic in psychology that we have only a slice of the people that we then turn around and wildly generalize to outside of psychology. And they generally have large enough sample sizes that these small effects that we have in psychology, 0.15, 0.18, 0.20. 5 minutes. I'm almost at the end. That we can actually find those effects if those effects are important to us. That's the big deal. It's not get rid of these effects and try to find large ones, that you have to have enough power in your study to find the subtle effects of psychology. And it means you're going to have a higher N. Sorry, don't even look at this. So this is in the paper I have with Julie. These are all the places you can download. And I think I made this available online, but it's actually a preprint is available on the Psych archives. And because people are always like, where do I get this data? This is a huge list of all the data you can get. This is in Child Development Perspectives about why you should use it. I'm going to go through these quickly. So for those of you who recognize anything on here, these are all used in the national studies. All of these, and you find your favorite one: PBVT, Woodcock-Johnson, IQ digit span, problem behaviors, CBCL, social skills rating, self-concept, executive functions, Bailey, alcohol and drug usage, home scale. All of these are available. Things that you use every day that you care about are in these. These are the kind of ones you can use if you want to look at birth cohorts, schooling, alcohol and drugs, ad health, and monitoring the future. Have amazing data sets for that. They're representative. You can look at studies. So I look at differences between race and SES. And in previous time, if you just do it yourself, you're always generally looking at middle class, and you're comparing them to poverty. African Americans were never the right comparison. So you can actually do correct comparisons of race in the country and SES. If you study small, rare populations, so I have a person who's looking at, one of my students is looking at in the ECLSK, what if you have high education and you're in poverty? So do we think that the kids are actually going to do better if the parents educated but they're in poverty? So she's able to actually find a sample of 500 people. You would not ever find this in Ann Arbor, by the way, if you had to do primary data collection. She's able to get 500 families in the ECLSK that she can look at, right? So, so for small or rare populations, you can do the complex models of development. So this is another thing. We do get power in developmental by having a within. So this is kind of multiple things that we're doing. So you get that, but you still, if you have a very complicated question, you still need power. The more variables you add, the more power you need in your study, right? If you have an underpowered study, you can ask only very simple questions, only a few variables. That's one of the ways that you kind of get back some of the power of your N, is to make your questions simpler, less variables. Some people don't know that. So you can't go in with your 5 or 6 things that you thought you were going to do if you have 30 people, right? You can't do it. You can replicate. We've done a lot of replications. You can increase your power. You can generalize to the population. And you can use rigorous advanced methods. So here's some of the limitations. There's limited measurement. They're not the kind of measurements that we always, even though right now we're talking about the crisis in psychology, there's now the second crisis is in measurement, that our measurements have been so poor and they've introduced so much error that we don't know what we said we measured, if it's ever been true. So there's currently a new crisis in psychology. Crisis every day in psychology. You don't have control in the study content. So when people say, why didn't you look at this? Well, I didn't look at it because they didn't look at it. You know, and so yes, you're right, that's interesting, I can't do it. May not adequately address aspects of the questions you want. You have to understand what to do about missing data, because it's longitude. That's true for all longitudinal data. And there can be data management nightmares. The worst thing that you'll hear from people is like, you know, I don't know what to do with all of this and how to merge these together and what the hell are these variable names. And so it can be, but I can tell you whenever I look at small things, I have the same nightmares, but it can be, it can be overwhelming. But once you get it, it's kind of nice. Once you do it, then you kind of like get used to it and you can do it with other data sets. Oop. So I end with, I'm going to show you one more slide after this, but what is your question? If any of these things fall in your area, you can answer them on existing data. There's tons of existing data to look at this, because we do aging especially. We have so many good large set data sets on issues of aging and cognitive decline that people can look at. Do they vary by country? Are we all really different? So we've done a lot of replications across the UK, and it ends up being whatever we do poorly, they do poorly as well. So we really don't find differences in their system, which is a different system than our system. People still have the same problems. And I'm going to put a little plug in for a meeting that I'm running in Arizona this fall. The deadline is next Thursday for turning in papers, posters, and we have an innovation poster session, which is you've never used secondary data before. You have a question, your poster is on your question, and we will hook you up with data sets and resources so that you can use secondary data. Everyone should feel free, no matter what your experience is, to apply. If you already use secondary or open source data, so Brian Nozick and Ross Poldrick, who does neuroscience, will be there, and they're going to be talking about the resources available. There's also large open genetic data that's available that people can get. So we're basically going to be telling we talked about administrative data as well. There's large amounts of administrative data that you can connect to existing data sets that enhance the data that you have. Liz Gershoff will be there talking about the administrative education data that can be added to data. Actually, in the world of education, it's endless the amount of administrative data that can be added to existing data to enhance it. So please think about coming. Make sure, feel free to send anything. We will try to help you. This is really a meeting to introduce the fact that there's all these resources available. You don't have to run underpowered studies. You don't have to do a dissertation that's on unpowered studies. There are options. There will be other people there that are willing to make some of their data available to other people, to analyze it, and to create consortiums and relationships. So you should, these nice small meetings, you actually talk to people. So it's not really the faculty standing over here and the students standing over here. There really is a lot of interactions between the faculty and the students, and so it's a really great meeting to be at, and we've set up a lot of interactions. ICPSR will be there showing off their data sets. So we have a lot coming, so please think about that, and I'm done.
Questions?
Yep. I know it's a lot of information, but please ask.
I have one to start us off, Pam. I wonder to what extent you think the replication crisis is limited to psychology, so versus other fields. So, for example, in the cancer drug trials, they're trying to replicate and
they're failing. Yeah, they're failing. Yeah.
Really well.
Yep.
And then, since I know we have a lot of education students here, and you know the education literature, to what extent do you think that this applies to education as well?
So one of the things we can say about psychology is often as awful as this we're actually dealing with it. Medicine particularly has an even bigger problem, because what I try to say is, at least in psychology, we don't actually, the research we do can't actually kill people, we hope. But in medicine, when they make mistakes, it can. Or people suffer through all kinds of side effects of medication that was never efficacious. So one of the things that NIH did, and they actually presented at the APS meeting I was talking about, is they came and talked about how pharmaceuticals that were coming on to the market, they were coming through NIH. About 80% were found to be efficacious, and they were going out and being used by people. And when they started doing, and I didn't talk about this in here because it's a lot to do, but pre-registration, so people were concerned they weren't replicating, these pharmaceuticals weren't replicating, so NIH said you cannot put any pharmaceuticals through here without pre-registration. You have to pre-register your hypothesis, you have to tell us what your effect size is. And when they did, it went down to 30% efficacy. So you can imagine all of those drugs that got out onto the market that people were taking that had absolutely no impact on whatever they thought it was having an impact on, right? Because the pharmaceutical company was harking and p-hacking their data as well. And they know that. So you were talking about the cancer ones, a very mini lab study that came out with cancer research. They got into it because they wanted to clean it up. They were surprised at how few of the cancer research ones were replicating. They were shocked and dismayed, because a lot of this were ongoing things that they were using with cancer patients just to find out they weren't efficacious, right? So it is a big problem, and it's a bigger problem in medicine. Public health has it, econ has it. Sociology, I think, it's too bad Rob's not here, but sociology, I think, would also, it's a good question as to whether or not they are finding the same thing in their population studies, right? What happens when you weight the population differently? What does that mean? So everybody in science has this problem, because it wasn't just psychology that got bad, everybody got bad, right? And everybody wanted publications, and so people were doing what it took to get a publication instead of doing the science. So we really veered away from science and went into this crazy harking, p-hacking mode. For achievement, the issue I think there is how many interventions we have that are not replicated, that are not even coming from good science, that are being put out there every single day. So we're putting all these people through interventions. They're not showing to be efficacious. They're fading out. And whether or not the science that we've even used to create them is the correct science, right? So should we be thinking about doing things differently? Do we really need to clean that up so we actually have an idea of what basic skills in reading are? What are basic skills in math? What are the impact of attention and social skills? How would social skills be more important as they get older versus in kindergarten? I mean, this is the problem too with development. Social skills may be important, but it may not be preschool and kindergarten that they're important. It may be junior high and high school that they come on and shift your grades around. So just think better about when that impact should be happening, instead of saying it's always. I mean, whenever we say anything, it's always like, it always is important. And it isn't always important, because we develop and change and our needs change across time. And I think with the aging stuff, it's really quite interesting to see the cognitive decline as well, and how that relates to early issues. We're starting to see people actually hook up the whole age thing and say that people who had basic skills problems early on also look to be declining in cognitive skills much more later on, right? So we've called it an SES effect, but it does look like something we can actually track all the way back to problems early in schooling. Not surprising, but people were really like, this is what you did here, and then you did it here, and they're not connected even though you're the same person, right? So those kind of things are starting to happen. As people, I think, go back to the thinking instead of just analyzing, right? Thinking about the questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. I've got a lot of thoughts running around in my head about this. I'm curious if you can, I'm thinking about the precision medicine initiative that's coming up at NIH, and this All of Us program that they're attempting to create this massive data set. I'm curious if you think that approaches like that are going to help kind of alleviate some of these problems with regards to how we approach secondary data and the work that we do, or if it might actually perpetuate some of these problems as people now have these really large data sets to be able to mine and p-hack and do all these other things with, or other thoughts you might have about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think having more power doesn't mean you're going to have more access to harking and p-hacking is just bad science, right? And if the incentive structure doesn't change, that's really the problem. Then people can do anything, even with primary. It doesn't matter if it's secondary or primary, and that's what they have been doing. I think more data on these things. What I thought you were going to go say is like, well, if it's being designed by other people and you don't have a say. I mean, that to me is kind of a problem, right? I mean, the thing I like about putting together and getting groups of people who've run their own longitudinal research because they had questions is that you kind of get the value of the depth of those questions. And so I would rather people say, I think this is how we should do it, and then think about whether or not that's true. Prove to me, I mean, I really am a measurement person as well. Prove to me your measures are correct. One of my students came to me the other day and said, oh my gosh, this paper got, they were reading, everyone's a cynic now, that was my student, sadly. But they're reading like papers, and one of my colleagues had a paper who printed a 0.5 reliability. And my student said, how did that get published? It's a 0.5. And I said, excellent question. No adjustment for the lack of reliability of the measure. And you can do those adjustments even in regression, but people don't. You can definitely do it in sim. And I said, yeah, I mean, how did that get published? It's a great question, right? We're perfectly happy for that measurement to have that kind of noise in it, and then call it whatever we said it was, right? And that's important because we do have things, I review all the time things that are really unreliable. And people actually say, well, it has moderate reliability. I'm like, 0.4 is not moderate. I don't know what world you're in, or it has adequate reliability. I'm like, no, you know, and so there's noise coming in there, and people aren't really attending to what it means to have that kind of noisy measure, and then call that self-concept or achievement or whatever behavior problems. So we're not even kind of addressing those issues that are pretty important. And I think sometimes, like for me, like I have these big echo grants, I'm really concerned. One of my newest things is looking at the environment and exposure to lead. So here's my big thing. I've been looking at achievement trajectories forever. And now we know how important lead is and the amount of exposure. And I'm like, oh my God, what if all these differences that we blamed on teachers are actually exposure to lead? Right, because they're coming, SES kids are exposed to lead more often, and no one looked at the biological indicators, right? So this is one of the big kind of things I want to look at. I don't know if it'll explain the full achievement gap, but it might actually reduce what we're looking at as far. And then what we need to worry about is where schools are built. Like how many toxicants are we okay with our kids having? And so those are the kind of questions, and I need decent sample sizes because exposures can be small, right? So I have to look at that. But those are the kind of like questions that you can get at. And they have these echo grants where they're kind of deciding things. And I'd rather be able to have my own input as to how I want to look at it. And so I am worried about that. Like, I would rather people organically come together in collaboratives and bring their kind of data in and use other people's existing data. I'm okay with these other, I mean, all these other ones have been done that way, but it should be a combination of both so that they do precision medicine and I also have the opportunity to design one too, and then I can add it to that data set just to make sure we have the variability of thinking in there, right? Otherwise, we will all start thinking the same way. And I'm not sure that's the right way. We need that innovation coming in from scientists thinking about things differently.
One more question.
Yeah.
Question about, well, you mentioned incentive structure.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering whether you foresee that there might be changes in incentive structure, or is it going to be more about the accountability where people know that their things are being hacked? Right now they're the badges, but do you see that being something that is more implemented widely?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so right now the people who seem to have the worst fear, and I think it's real fear, are graduate students and junior faculty, right? Because this is changing right as they have the old structure and this new push coming through, right? That's coming from people that are looking at, and it's anyone now, because as soon as you publish something, it's available for people to look at and say, nope, this is not right. There was p-hacking or harking or whatever involved. And I believe now that the train is moving so quickly that incentive structure is actually going to change pretty quickly, because NIH and NSF are now coming online, saying we have paid for all of this, and now we're finding out that this was done incorrectly, and we're not okay with that, right? So I think as soon as the funders come on, and I did actually have a conversation with my dean because I was like, the incentive structure is wrong, and he said, you know what? I am the dean of arts and science, and so in humanities, they publish a book and they get tenure, they publish a second book and they become a full professor. So we deal with all of that. If you want to tell me that psychology should have a different one, then tell us. That's what we do. It's not coming from the dean's office, it's coming from our chairs, right? It's coming from our other faculty, that there needs to be someone sitting there going, don't we care about the quality of the paper and not the amount of the paper, right? And all of us would be, oh yeah, it was always quality. But then we're sitting there looking at, you know, people's H-index, and we're looking at Google Scholar, and we're looking at all of that. So that structure of how we put people up for tenure, or even third-year reviews, have to change. We actually have to read the papers and say, is this a high-quality paper? Do we think this scientist has done what they need to do? Right? And it can't be on these numbers, right? Because we've now manipulated the numbers by manipulating the science. So those numbers don't even matter anymore, right? I mean, in fact, I would just lay down, I would put at the beginning of my research statement that because there's been so many issues that you decided to do really strong papers that are really rigorous, and that's what you wrote, right? And many of them are getting into top journals. You know, the really rigorous ones are getting into top journals because people are like, oh, this was actually done correctly. We probably should publish that, right? And null results are now being published. So more and more of the journals are publishing null results. So no matter what you find in your research, it's important, because as we were talking about, there's a huge publication bias in meta-analyses. Because we don't know what the null results were. So we have this very positive peaked bias for all of our effect sizes, but we don't know all the ones that didn't have that. So we can't correct the curve because of the publication bias in meta-analysis, right?
All right, so we are at time.